Ryomen Sukuna may just be the most terrifying villain in anime history, but what if I told you that the King of Curses isn't actually evil at all, but rather the most honest character in Jujutsu Kaisen, and that everything we think we know about good and evil might be completely backwards when it comes to understanding his true nature? Well, I'm about to challenge everything you believe about heroes and villains by taking you through every moment of Sukuna's 1,000-year existence and revealing why this so-called monster might actually be the only one telling the truth about what it means to be strong and what power really represents in our world. Because while everyone else hides behind moral pretenses and noble justifications, Sukuna stands as the brutal embodiment of honesty about human nature and the way strength actually works. And maybe, just maybe, that makes him less of a villain and more of a mirror that shows us what we really are underneath all our civilized facades. So let me tell you the story of a man who refused to bow to anyone or anything, who embraced his nature completely without apology, and who became exactly what the world needed him to become. And together we'll discover why Sukuna's brutal honesty about power and survival makes everyone else look like hypocrites who lie to themselves about their own motivations. So get ready, sit back, grab a snack if you want, and enjoy this deep dive into the unapologetic existence of the King of Curses. Because by the end, you might find yourself questioning who the real monsters are in this story. To understand Sukuna, we have to go back over 1,000 years to the Heian era, which was considered the golden age of Jujutsu sorcery. And this wasn't some peaceful time of enlightenment. This was a period where cursed spirits roamed freely and sorcerers fought brutal battles for survival and dominance. And into this world of constant conflict and death was born a man who would eventually become known as Ryomen Sukuna. And here's the thing about the Heian era. It was a time when strength truly was the only currency that mattered, where the weak were devoured by the strong without any pretense of morality or justice. And Sukuna didn't create this reality. He was simply born into it. And unlike everyone else who might have lamented the cruelty of their world or tried to change it, Sukuna looked around and said, this is exactly how things should be. And could it be that Sukuna's so-called evil is just radical honesty, human nature, and the way power actually works in the real world? Because while other sorcerers of his era might have killed just as many people, they probably told themselves they were doing it for noble reasons or for the greater good. But Sukuna never bothered with such lies. He killed because he was strong enough to kill and because he enjoyed the act of domination. And maybe that brutal honesty is what really sets him apart from everyone else. And as he grew in power, transcending the limitations of human mortality and developing his iconic four-armed, two-faced form, he wasn't becoming a monster. He was becoming the purest expression of what power looks like when it's stripped of all pretense and social conditioning. And interesting how even his physical transformation reflects his philosophical stance. Because while most people hide their true nature behind masks of civility, Sukuna literally wore his duality on his face, showing the world exactly what he was, without any attempt to deceive or manipulate through false nobility. And this brings us to the period when Sukuna truly earned his title as the King of Curses. And during this time, he didn't just rule through fear, he ruled through the simple acknowledgement that strength is the only truth that matters in this world. And his reign of terror across Japan wasn't motivated by some tragic backstory or noble goal that got corrupted along the way. It was motivated by the pure joy he found in exercising his power and proving his dominance over those weaker than himself. And here's where it gets really interesting, because Sukuna's philosophy of strength as the only truth isn't just some edgelord nihilism. It's actually a brutally honest assessment of how the world actually works. Because think about it, every society, every government, every social structure is ultimately built on the threat of force and violence. But most people prefer to pretend otherwise. They create elaborate moral systems and legal frameworks to disguise the fact that at the end of the day, those with power make the rules, and those without power follow them or face the consequences. And Sukuna simply cut through all that pretense and said, why are we lying to ourselves about this? And his relationship with Ryomen is actually fascinating, because it shows that Sukuna isn't incapable of forming connections. He just forms them based on merit and strength rather than sentiment. And Ryomen earned Sukuna's respect, not through emotional manipulation or moral appeals, but by being genuinely useful and powerful enough to serve him effectively. And interesting how Sukuna forms genuine respect only for those who can actually threaten him, which says something profound profound about how he understands relationships, because unlike most people who form bonds based on emotional dependency or social convenience, Sukuna only values those who bring something real to the table. And maybe that's a more honest basis for relationships than the lies we tell ourselves about unconditional love and selfless friendship. And when he was finally defeated and sealed by the combined efforts of the strongest sorcerers of his era, it wasn't because good triumphed over evil. It was because even the strongest individual can be overwhelmed by numbers and strategy. And Sukuna understood this. He wasn't bitter about his defeat because he recognized it as the natural consequence of being outnumbered by those who were individually weaker but collectively stronger. For over 1,000 years, Sukuna remained sealed within his 20 fingers, but this wasn't a period of dormancy for him because his consciousness remained active, watching the world change and evolve. And what he saw during this time probably only confirmed his beliefs about the nature of power and weakness, because as the centuries passed, the jujutsu world became increasingly bureaucratic and political, with strength taking a backseat to institutional authority, political maneuvering, and imagine how disgusting this must have been for someone like Sukuna to watch. Because here was a world that had once operated on the honest principles of might makes, right? Slowly degenerating into a system where mediocre sorcerers could gain power through paperwork and political connections rather than actual strength. And maybe Sukuna was proven right about the decline of true strength when he saw how bureaucracy replaced merit in the jujutsu world. Because the higher-ups who controlled jujutsu society weren't the strongest sorcerers. They were just the most politically savvy. And this must have confirmed for Sukuna that when societies move away from honest acknowledgement of power dynamics, they become weak and corrupt and hypocritical. And his growing disappointment with the modern world wasn't just about nostalgia for his era. It was about watching a world that had abandoned truth in favor of comfortable lies. And when he finally sensed the presence of Satoru Gojo, the first truly powerful sorcerer he had encountered in centuries, it must have been like finding water in a desert. Because finally, here was someone who might understand what real strength looked like, even if Gojo wrapped his power in modern moral pretenses. And this brings us to Sukuna's rebirth through Yuji Itadori. And the irony here is absolutely perfect, because Yuji represents everything that Sukuna finds weak and contemptible about modern humanity. His selflessness, his desire to save everyone, his refusal to acknowledge the natural hierarchy of strength, and yet Yuji's unique physical capabilities, and his lack of cursed energy made him the perfect vessel for Sukuna's return. And from the moment Sukuna awakened in Yuji's body, his assessment of the modern jujutsu world was swift and damning, because he looked around and saw sorcerers who were weaker than their predecessors, more concerned with rules and regulations than with actual power, and more interested in maintaining the status quo than in pursuing true strength. And his initial encounters with modern cursed spirits and sorcerers only confirmed his suspicions that the world had grown soft and weak and hypocritical. And it's clear that Sukuna wasn't just disappointed with modern sorcerers. He was disgusted by their weakness, disguised as morality. Because here were people who still killed and fought and exercised power over others, but they insisted on justifying their actions with elaborate moral frameworks and noble intentions. And to Sukuna, this wasn't enlightenment, it was cowardice, because at least he was honest about what he was while they lied to themselves and others about their true motivations. And then he encountered Gojo, and suddenly everything changed. Because for the first time in over a millennium, Sukuna was faced with someone who possessed genuine, overwhelming power. And his reaction wasn't fear or anger, it was excitement and anticipation. Because finally, here was someone worthy of his attention. Someone who might actually understand what it means to be truly strong, even if Gojo buried that understanding beneath layers of modern moral conditioning. But it was during the Shibuya incident that Sukuna truly revealed his nature to the modern world. And this moment represents one of the most honest displays of power in the entire series. Because when Sukuna took control of Yuji's body and began his rampage through Shibuya, he didn't bother with justifications or noble goals. He simply exercised his power because he could and because he enjoyed it. And the massacre that followed wasn't about achieving some greater purpose. It was about the pure joy of domination and destruction. And here's what makes this so philosophically interesting. Sukuna's actions in Shibuya were horrific and inexcusable, but they were also completely honest, because he wasn't pretending to be saving anyone or fighting for justice. He was just being exactly what he was, a powerful being who enjoys exercising that power over those weaker than himself? And could it be that Sukuna's brutality is actually more honest than everyone else's pretense of being noble while still killing when convenient? Because think about how many characters in Jujutsu Kaisen have killed people while telling themselves they were doing it for the greater good. And how is that morally superior to someone who kills simply because they can and want to? And Sukuna's complete lack of justification for his actions might actually be more ethically honest than the elaborate moral frameworks that other characters use to justify their violence. And his joy in destruction isn't sadism for its own sake. It's the natural expression of a being who has accepted what he is without trying to hide behind noble pretenses. And maybe that makes him less of a monster and more of a mirror that shows us how hollow our own moral justifications really are. And this leads us to perhaps the most brilliant aspect of Sukuna's character, which is his obsession with Megumi Fushiguro and his long-term plan to possess the young sorcerer. Because this wasn't just about wanting a stronger body. It was about recognizing potential and understanding how power really works. And Sukuna saw in Megumi something that even Gojo missed, which was the capacity for absolute ruthlessness hidden beneath a veneer of moral restraint and his patient manipulation of events to eventually possess. Megumi represents the culmination of everything Sukuna understands about power, because he knew that raw strength alone wasn't enough. He needed intelligence, strategy, and the ability to use others' weaknesses against them. And when he finally succeeded in taking over Megumi's body, it wasn't just a tactical victory, it was a philosophical one, because he had proven that sentiment and emotional attachment are ultimately weaknesses that can be exploited by those willing to be ruthless. And maybe this is Sukuna's most honest moment, showing exactly how power really works when you strip away all the moral pretenses, because he used Megumi's love for his sister against him. He exploited Yuji's desire to save his friend, and he turned their bonds of affection into weapons. And this isn't cartoon villainy. This is a demonstration of how emotional manipulation actually works in the real world, where those willing to exploit others' feelings will always have an advantage over those who allow sentiment to cloud their judgment. And the cruelest part is that Sukuna forced Megumi's friends to fight against their ally's body, making them confront the reality that sometimes there are no good choices, and sometimes the people you care about become your enemies through no fault of their own. But the ultimate test of Sukuna's philosophy came in his final battle against Gojo Satoru, because this wasn't just a fight between two powerful individuals. It was a clash between two completely different ways of understanding strength and power. And on one side, you had Gojo, who, despite his overwhelming abilities, still believed in restraint and protection and moral responsibility. And on the other side, you had Sukuna, who believed that power exists to be used and that holding back is a form of disrespect to one's own strength. And the battle itself was a masterclass in how these different philosophies play out in practice. Because Gojo, with all his power, was still constrained by his desire to protect others and his belief in moral limitations, while Sukuna fought with complete ruthlessness and strategic brilliance, using every advantage he could find, including exploiting Gojo's own moral restraints against him. And when Sukuna ultimately emerged victorious, it wasn't just because he was stronger, it was because he was willing to be more ruthless, more strategic, and more honest about what victory actually requires. And interesting how Sukuna's victory represents the triumph of honest strength over restrained power, because Gojo's defeat came not from a lack of ability, but from his unwillingness to abandon his principles, even when those principles made him vulnerable. Maybe this is the central tragedy of the entire series, that the most moral character was defeated by the most honest one. And that Sukuna's vindication after 1,000 years of waiting proved that his understanding of power was ultimately more accurate than anyone wanted to admit. And as he continued to dominate the next generation of sorcerers who came after Gojo, it became clear that their combined moral strength was no match for his individual honest brutality. So is Sukuna truly evil or just the most honest? And this is the question that his entire character forces us to confront, because if we define evil as causing harm to others, then yes, Sukuna is undoubtedly evil. But if we define evil as dishonesty about one's nature and motivations, then maybe he's the least evil character in the entire series, because he never lies about what he is or what he wants. He never pretends to be fighting for noble causes or protecting innocent people. He simply exists as pure power, unbound by moral constraints or social expectations. And maybe the real question isn't whether Sukuna is evil, but whether we're all just hypocrites who refuse to admit what strength really means, because every society, every government, every social structure ultimately depends on violence or the threat of violence to maintain order. And yet we pretend that this violence is somehow different when it's sanctioned by authority or justified by moral frameworks. And Sukuna forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that power is power, regardless of how we dress it up in noble language, and that those who possess strength will always dominate those who don't. And perhaps his role in the story isn't to be defeated by moral goodness, but to serve as a mirror that shows everyone else the hypocrisy in their own positions, because he embodies natural law in its purest form. The idea that strength determines survival and that everything else is just elaborate pretense, and maybe that's why he's so terrifying. Not because he's evil, but because he's honest about truths that the rest of us would rather ignore. And his existence forces everyone around him to confront their own capacity for violence and domination, even as they tell themselves they're different from him. If you enjoyed this exploration of the King of Curses and this different perspective on what might be the most misunderstood character in anime, you should definitely check out my analysis of how Gojo's moral restraints ultimately led to his downfall, or my deep dive into why Yuji Itadori represents everything that's both beautiful and naive about modern heroism. Both videos explore the same themes of power, morality, and honesty that make Sukuna such a fascinating character. And if this video made you question your assumptions about good and evil in ways you didn't expect, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more philosophical deep dives into your favorite anime characters. And remember, sometimes the monster is the only one telling the truth. Have a good one.